Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through the industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Paolo Gaudiano. He is a DEI expert, founder of DEI tech company Aleria and the research nonprofit ARC. Welcome to the show, Paolo.
Thank you, AJ. It's a real pleasure to be here.
You are welcome. Welcome to the show, Paolo. Welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk right now. We'll learn from you about merit. We'll learn about diversity. We'll learn whether it is together or is it versus merit and diversity. We'll learn all that from you. But before that, Paolo, let's learn a bit more about you, your journey, your background, so that the audience learns about who they are listening to.
Happy to do that. Thank you so much. So my name is Paolo Gaudiano. I'm actually dialed in from New York right now. I'm originally from Italy, and I spent quite a bit of time in Italy as well, where much of my family still resides. I am in the United States, as you may be aware. There is a lot of conversation going on right now about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when I talk about my work, I always like to begin by addressing what I jokingly call the white elephant in the room, which is to say, what is a guy like me? I'm white, I'm male, I'm cisgender, I have all the privilege in the world. Why am I working in diversity, equity, and inclusion? And the way that I came into the space is that I did a lot of work first as an academic for about 10 years, and then as an entrepreneur and consultant for about 15 years, working on an understanding of how people fit within an organization, how people fit or consumers fit within a marketplace, and using a quantitative approach to really try to understand the link between the individual and whatever collective they're a part of. And then about 10 years ago in 2015, I had this moment when I realized that the work that I had been doing more for professional work and helping large companies solve complex problems could potentially be applied to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I got very excited about the idea of being able to do something that was meaningful for society and not just to make money, if you will. And I started to work in that space. I spent about a year doing research, got all excited about it, and then realized that I was onto something really, really powerful. And then over the last 9 years or so, since I started to actually work at Aleria, the company that I founded, we've realized a lot of very, very interesting things that came from understanding the work from a scientific perspective. And I'm hoping today we'll be able to uncover some of those issues and how they relate to some of the ongoing debates about diversity versus merit.
Absolutely, absolutely, Paolo. So first, let's understand, all this talk about DEI has been quite a bit there for quite some time now. And there is a lot of talk nowadays about DEI. So in your understanding, is DEI, the whole concept of DEI, the talk about DEI, is it winning or is it losing as we start 2025?
Well, right now, I would say that if you take your question at a kind of superficially, I would say you could say that DI is losing in a way. But I think the fundamental problem that I'm seeing is that what the mass media and what a lot of people who are detractors, if you will, are using to describe DEI is not really an accurate description. What happens is that some people have taken what I consider to be extreme aspects of DEI, and they have used those as being representative of all of DEI. And what I mean specifically is that there are some aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion that tend to focus specifically on quotas or targets, as we say in the United States, where the quotas are allegedly not legal. And by focusing on certain specific aspects of diversity, in a way, I feel like we've shot ourselves in the foot, because it's given rise to a very strong backlash from people who feel that if we're going to be supporting, for example, people of color, then it means that we're going to be damaging white people. If we're going to be supporting women, it means that we're going to be damaging men. And unfortunately, that's actually something that is causing this backlash. And it's kind of interesting, but to be not arrogant about it. But in 2018, I write regularly for Forbes, and I wrote an article in which I said, if we continue to focus on diversity alone as the only part of DEI that people talk about, it's going to create backlash. And it's going to lead to, and essentially I kind of predicted what was going to happen, that there was going to be a lot of complaints of reverse discrimination. So what happened is that when in 2020, there was a very well-known murder of George Floyd here in the United States that caused tremendous amount of excitement about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a lot of anger about the kinds of inequalities that we'd seen. People started to push DEI, but unfortunately, a lot of that was pushed, in my opinion, in the wrong way. It was really focusing on issues of justice and fairness and racism, a lot of things that made people very, very uncomfortable. And unfortunately, that was not coupled with very significant advances in progress, and that led to the backlash that we've seen. So right now, yes, DEI is in a very, very bad situation, but I think again it boils down to how people define DEI, and unfortunately, right now, a lot of people have a wrong conception of what DEI is truly all about.
Okay, okay, Paulo. So if I understand, if we take just the D of the DEI, that is where the problem is. We have to take it in full measure. We'll come to your book, Measuring Inclusion. We'll come to that certainly. But if we take that in full measure, then perhaps this will not be a problem. But why did just some of these people or the industry looked only at diversity? Because it can be seen as soon as you enter, it can be seen, it can be numbered, and then you can look to be very, very good organizers. And it looks to be the easiest part. What is your understanding? Is it because of that, or is there something else which I'm missing out?
Yeah, no, AJ, I think you're pretty much correct, which is that I think that diversity in a way is the most visible aspect of the DEI, and I like to call it the diversity disconnect, right? We talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. Sometimes people talk about belonging, access, justice, and a number of other letters. But ultimately, when you look at most initiatives and really the entirety of the data that people have been collecting historically, it's been focused on diversity. Now, why is that? I think there's a couple of reasons. One of them is because diversity, in a way, is the easiest thing to measure. You can basically ask people to identify in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, whether or not they have disabilities, and then you can create a table and you can say, well, this is how many people we have of one type of the other, etc. And so what happened is that historically, my opinion, and by the way, a lot of this work, I will make references to USA-centric ideas and themes, but I think that a lot of that kind of discussion and motivation is driven primarily by the US and then spreads to other parts of the world. But in the US, there are some unique aspects that have to do with race. And so in the 1960s, after the civil rights movement, as we started to see more people of color, and at the same time also more women entering the workforce, what happened is that there were not a lot of these people, and they were not treated very well. But the only way that they could really identify that something was wrong was to look around and say, look, there are very few of us. You get to leadership roles and there are virtually no Black people, no Hispanics, very few women. And so diversity became kind of the torch that everyone carried, and it became the thing that everybody measured. And I think that partly because of that, and then the other reason is that while diversity is relatively easy to define, inclusion, equity, belonging are really complicated. You ask 10 people to define what inclusion means, you will get 10 different answers. And a lot of times these answers are very confusing. They're very circular. I've heard people say, well, inclusion is making sure that everybody feels that they belong. And then you say, well, what does belonging mean? Well, belonging means that everybody's included, and then you get into problems like that. And it's very difficult to quantify, which is why I was very excited about the work that I'm doing, which is specifically about, let's recognize that we need diversity, we need equity, we need inclusion. Let's understand how they all fit together. And let's make sure that we can measure all of them, or at least start to go beyond just measuring diversity alone, because it's that focus on diversity that unfortunately is creating this backlash. Because if you say, I'm going to increase the number of people of color by 10%, then it's implied that you're going to decrease the number of, or the proportion of white people by 10%. And of course, that feels like discrimination. And if you couch it in those terms, it is a form of discrimination. I will argue, we can talk about that later. I think the entire argument is flawed. But ultimately, that's why I think the origin of diversity focus came from those two issues, the fact that it's the only thing that you see and the fact that it's the only thing that's defined somewhat clearly.
Right, Paulo. So the equity and inclusion part has not been understood. Is it too late now for them to be understood and implemented, and rather they should do the course correction just on diversity itself, so that at least this part stays and they are able to implement it in the right manner? Or is it that it has to be all three of these words, and then that will be a bright sunny day for everyone? Is there room for that? Because a new administration is coming in, not to politicize anything, but to understand how are things looking on the ground, or should there be something else that should replace DEI with something else much more like this, but much more easy to understand?
Well, that's a really good question. And honestly, it's unfortunate that so much of DI has been politicized during the presidential election campaign last year and currently in the administration. I think that some aspect of DI will continue to exist. But I like to think that in fact when I wrote my book, there was already a lot of backlash happening, and I purposefully stuck with the idea of DEI, even though it was focusing more on inclusion, because ultimately I realized that you need to understand all the pieces. So and just briefly, the way that I talk about it is that I say that inclusion is about what you do as an organization, diversity is what you get, and then equity is what you want. So I try to make the definitions really simple. And one of the analogies that have been given is the following. If you think of your people as assets and you ask, well, how do we manage other kinds of assets in an organization? And I would say in particular, if you look at financial assets, when you talk to a chief financial officer of an organization, they have typically three different kinds of views or three different kinds of reports that they like to look at. They look at the balance sheet, they look at the P&L or income statement, and they look at the cash flow. Now, the balance sheet is giving you a snapshot in time of where you are as an organization in terms of the mixture of assets that you have. So diversity is very much like your balance sheet. It's a representation of where you are. That's why I say diversity is what you get. But what you need to understand is how you got there. Imagine if you were a CFO and the only thing that you had was the balance sheet. It would be impossible to run the organization. You would say, well, we don't have enough cash. But if you don't know where that cash is bleeding out, how you're spending the money, if you're not tracking which departments are spending more money and spending less money, you would be completely unable to do anything about it. And so with DEI, I think it's the same thing. And inclusion, the way that we measure it, when I say inclusion is what you do as an organization, it's a recognition that ultimately your people are very valuable assets. And anything that happens to them in the workplace that increases or decreases their value to you by increasing or decreasing their ability to do their work is going to be either a positive thing for you or a negative thing for you. So to me, inclusion is a bit like cash flow. It's about the day-to-day things that happen to the people in your organization. And to the extent that those experiences are different for different groups of people, that means that you're not being inclusive. So if I look, for example, at promotion rates, and I find that one group of people is getting promoted more frequently, more rapidly than another group of people, then it means that I am not being inclusive. When you think of it that way, it becomes a lot easier to draw that parallel. So inclusion is like your cash flow. Diversity is like your balance sheet. The reason why I say that equity is like in between, like your income statement, is because the way that I define equity is to say, well, if I have two groups of people that are being treated differently within the organization, and as a result of that, one of those groups is less satisfied, they will be less productive, which means that you're making less money, and they will be more likely to leave the organization, which means that you're going to have to pay a lot of money to recruit new people, hire them, train them, and get them back up to speed. So if you see any inequities in your organization, meaning that over a period of time, let's say on a quarterly basis, you see that one group of people is more satisfied than the other, you see that one group of people is essentially being excluded, you are losing money. And so my approach to it is to say, look, think of your people the way that you think about your financial assets. Think about them holistically and think about all the tools and the measurements that you need in order to be managing effectively what these human assets are doing for your organization. And recognize that what you as an organization allow to happen in the workplace, whether it's through individual interactions, whether it's through promotion processes, whether it's through the way that you recruit people, if you are not careful about what you're doing there, you can create strong imbalances, which will eventually cost you money and create a lot of strife. So that's the way that I try to draw those analogies. My hope is that rather than abandoning DEI, people will realize that a lot of the political posturing right now is just that. It's just political posturing. I don't believe that most politicians really understand how to manage organizations. If you're running a company, you have to worry about presenting your results to your shareholders. And if you have the most valuable asset in your organization, because people are the most expensive line item of every budget of every organization, and you do not know how to manage them successfully, you're going to lose. And so that's why I think that DI will come back. It will be even stronger once we understand that it's not about social justice and fairness. I mean, it is motivated by that, but ultimately it really has to do with let's make companies work more successfully, make more money, and make sure that all your employees are happier at the same time.
Absolutely, absolutely, Paulo. Be that whatever the state of DI at the moment, the whole idea is not about the words. It's about how humans think about others who are a bit less unfortunate. Who are a bit more unfortunate, who have come through a difficult road, and to give them opportunity is the desire of every human being. They always want to give some room to those people who have been left out in the cold. That's the idea. So whichever way, that's the human desire. In terms of understanding this better, one of the big things was that, the DEI is almost like a reverse discrimination, a form of reverse discrimination. Now, even if you bring another word for DEI, this particular thing will always be there, or vested interest will certainly bring it out. And companies or whoever are looking only for the profit motive, they will always go for the lowest hanging fruit. How would you like to tackle this particular whole idea about it being a form of reverse discrimination, by whatever name you call this initiative?
Yeah. No, and I'm glad that you're bringing this up, because as I hinted at before, if you take the attitude that, oh, well, these poor people have had a harder time and they've not had the same opportunities, we need to bring them into the company, and look at this, we only have 10% of them, so let's set a target to make them 20%. You're creating two problems. The first one is that you are absolutely creating a sense of reverse discrimination, because if you say, I'm going to purposely hire more people of color, that means I'm going to have fewer white people. At least that's the way that it's interpreted. And so right there, you are creating the sense of reverse discrimination. Now, why is that argument flawed? The reality is that, again, we can only measure diversity at the level of the entire company. But if we look more closely, we can see that the problem is not that we just have to stuff more people in the company, but that actually you have to focus about what happens once you're inside the company. And let me explain that. If you look at studies, for example, there was a study recently by Leanin and McKinsey, where every year they published a number of data reports, but one in particular where they show gender and racial representation at different levels within organizations. And what you find is that when you look at the entry level across large numbers of companies in the United States, and again, this is particular for the United States, but there are similar kinds of imbalances in other countries as well. They might have to do with gender or with caste or with religion. But if you look in the United States at the entry level, white men make up 34% of the employees. By the time you get to the executive level, you find that white men make up 57%. So from the entry level to the executive level, there's a huge growth in the representation of white men at the expense of the other groups, which means that it's not that you have to stuff more people in. It's like you have a leaky bucket. You're losing people out, and just pouring more water from the top is going to make a big mess on the floor. So the problem is not, oh, we see that there is a low number of people of color or women, so let's just stuff more people in there. You need to understand why you're losing those people along the way. And one of the analogies that I like to give is the following. Imagine I come home one day in the wintertime and my house feels really cold. And I look at the thermostat and it reads 10 degrees Celsius. Oh my God, it's so cold, right? Oh, I know how to fix that. I light a match under the thermostat. And look, now the thermostat reads 15 degrees, 20 degrees, 25 degrees. But meanwhile, the windows are open, the front door is drafty, and the roof is leaking. And you may burn your fingers, and you might burn the whole house down if you're not carefully. Unfortunately, that's exactly what has been happening with diversity, equity, and inclusion. We focus on the thermostat. We focus on the reading of where the human temperature, if you will, is in the organization. And then instead of asking, why is it cold? Is there a problem with windows? What do we measure to understand where the problems are? Let's measure air circulation. Let's measure heat loss. Let's measure thermal efficiency. Instead, we just blindly go and light a match on the thermostat. That is, in my opinion, the biggest problem that we're causing right now. And as long as people keep focusing only on diversity and trying to fix it directly, we're not going to be able to resolve these issues, and we will continue to have complaints about reverse discrimination. And then if I may say a second thing that's happening, which is really, really terrible, and we saw that during the elections as well, is that when you focus on DEI the way that most people have, you also create a problem for the very people that you're trying to help, because there is an implicit assumption that you only hire those people not because of their quality, not because of their merit, but because of their gender, because of their skin color, because of their nationality, because of their religion, and so on and so forth. And this has been a huge, huge problem, because what ends up happening is that people, and unfortunately our brains tend to recognize things that look different. So if I'm a white man in an organization, I'm surrounded primarily by white people, and I see a couple of black people, to me, they're going to look different. I'm going to put them in my mind in the same group. And if it turns out that one of them was hired, and maybe for whatever reason they're not performing as well as they could have, I'm going to assume that the person is not doing well because they're black, which is ridiculous because there are a lot of white people don't do well either. But we never say, oh, well, that guy failed and he's white, therefore white people must not be very qualified. But when you focus, when you put the spotlight on hiring people from different backgrounds, and then any of those people do not do 100%, then you're going to risk actually endangering the entire population because of these biases that we have. And I hear so many people that I know who identify as people of color in this country who are bitterly complaining about DEI right now because it's basically assumed that the only reason they are in the company, the only reason why they're getting promoted, the only reason why they're getting raises is because they're black or they're Hispanic or they're LGBTQ. And so that's really another devastating side effect of focusing on diversity alone. It's bad not only for reverse discrimination, but it causes people to accuse anyone who is not a white man, or in some cases a white woman. They accuse them of not being adequate, of not having the merit, of only being there because of the personal characteristics.
Right. What does the data say here, Paolo? And how have you dealt with whole issue in your book, award-winning book, Measuring Inclusion? And who is this book for?
Yeah, so this is the book. It just came out a few months ago, and it's called Measuring Inclusion. The subtitle is Higher Profits and Happier People Without Guesswork or Backlash. And I was really adamant about the subtitle because to me I really wanted to face the fact that there is a huge backlash, but also I talk about guesswork because I want to talk about the fact that a lot of the work that's done in diversity is not very quantitative. Beyond being able to measure how many people you have, very few people are able to actually quantify, predict, and measure the progress that results from different initiatives. And so a lot of what I've been trying to do is to say, look, instead of just focusing on measuring the diversity, let's try to figure out how do we find out the experiences of people and how those differ between different groups. Because ultimately, if I could understand why it is that in a typical organization, you'll find that not only do you have unusually low numbers of people of color, of women, of people with disabilities, but you will see that their retention rates are very low. Retention rates are low or churn is very high. So if, for example, the retention rate for white men in an organization is 90%, meaning that about 10% a year of the white men leave the organization. When you look at women, white women, that might be 18%. And when you look at black women, let's say, it might be 23%. And so what I wanted to understand is why is that happening? And what we realized was that ultimately it's not enough to know that a person is white or black or Hispanic or that has maybe a member of the LGBTQ community. You need to understand what are the things that happen to them in the workplace that interfere with their ability to succeed as a result of the fact that they may be gay or lesbian or may have a disability. And so we realized that one way to do that is rather than asking people, how do you feel? Do you feel that you belong in this organization, which is kind of useless? You should ask them, tell me about things that are happening to you at work that are interfering with your ability to do your work. Not about race, not about gender. I just want to know. So for example, if we hear a lot of people say, oh, I'm not getting invited to meetings in which decisions are made that impact my work. And let's say that we work with a company of 1,000 people and we see that 100 people complain about that problem. And then we see that of those 100 people, 70 of them happen to be women. Then we know that the company is not being inclusive because it's allowing behaviors to take place that are having a more negative impact on women than on men, as an example. And so the way that we measure inclusion is we do these workshops where we introduce the whole new way of thinking about DEI. We show some of the data we've collected before, and then we invite people to use a platform where they share completely anonymously and untraceably. They share specific experiences of things that happened to them. And then we have a simple way of categorizing in terms of what kind of thing was it? Did it have to do with your compensation? Did it have to do with promotions? Did it have to do with being respected at work? And then we also find out, well, why did this happen? Was it something that your colleagues did? Or was it your manager? Was it your leadership? And with the data, the combination of the categorization data and the qualitative description of the stories of things that happened to them, we can then identify where there are problems, where there are aspects of exclusion, if you will, where one group is being treated differently than another. And more importantly, we can understand exactly what is happening. So when I go back to the example before, if you find that there is a problem with people frequently being excluded from meetings in which they should have been invited, you could simply create a policy that says that any manager that hosts any meetings has to have a spreadsheet, and they have to check that they invite everyone. And they will actually be checked at the end of the quarter, for example, to make sure that they're doing that. And if they're not actually following up with those procedures, they can potentially be penalized in some way. In other words, make them accountable for it. So you're not saying, oh, you're a manager, you're a biased person, you're a bad person because you forgot to invite women. We're simply saying, look, these things happen. Let's create a procedure that's going to minimize the probability that these kinds of negative things will happen, and they will happen disparately to certain groups over other groups. And again, notice that when I say that, I'm not saying let's create more inclusive meetings for women or for people of color. I'm just saying, look, there is a problem with the way that you organize meetings. Let's fix that problem. And if it turns out that it was impacting 70 women and 20 Black people and 10 people with disabilities, then it means that you've really benefited all of those people without having to necessarily focus on their diversity. You really just simply focused on how do I get the most out of my people in my organization by ensuring that I'm avoiding any obstacles, I'm avoiding any problems that are causing them to be unable to do their work at their peak, which makes them frustrated, which means that they make less money for me and they're more likely to leave.
Right. One last question I want to understand. Do you think DEI word will stay, or will there be another word which will replace it?
You know, I am not sure, to be honest with you. In a way, I hope that DEI, I've been steady in using the term DEI by rather than throwing it out, you know, there's an expression, you know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think that trying to throw it out and changing the word is a mistake, in my opinion, because first of all, people are not stupid. If people object to the ideas and you simply change labels, and then they say, well, you're doing the same thing, but you're calling it something different, but it's still reverse discrimination, they're going to come after that too. I personally think that sticking with the term DEI, which has become somewhat universal, but explaining that it's not just about the D, admitting that we have made some mistakes in the field and that we have created the sense of reverse discrimination, and we made some other mistakes, I believe, in the space. If we can admit to those and improve things, my hope is that the term DEI will continue to stay, just because especially the D and the I have been around for a very long time. And I think that trying to throw that out the door and come up with entirely new names is a mistake. I would rather try to convince people, like some of our current political and business leaders, that their attacks on DEI are not only unnecessary, but they're shooting themselves in the foot. They're really going to hurt their own companies in the long term. And so my hope is that we will see a reversal. And I'm hoping that just by being more quantitative and understanding how to define the other letters of that alphabet, of that acronym, I should say, I'm hoping that this name will stick and that it will become a much better, much stronger, and really a key ingredient to the success of any organization.
Right. How about inclusion first? Bring the I first, then the equity later, and maybe diversity at the end.
So you know what's funny is that I thought about that. So what I talk about, inclusion is what you want, diversity is what you get. But the problem is that you get these weird things like IED or IED, which is also like an improvised explosive device, which is not a very good thing. I've heard people talk about ED and I. I mean, I think honestly, I would personally put the inclusion first, because inclusion is the cash flow, equity is the balance sheet, or is the P&L or income, and diversity to me is like the balance sheet. But honestly, I don't care about the order as long as people understand what those things mean and they react properly in a way that does not just, knee jerk, oh, you're a reverse racist because it means that you don't like white people. It's like, no, that's not really true. That's not what DEI really means.
Absolutely. There's much to learn about all these things from you, Paolo, and I'm sure a lot of people would want to learn more from you, about your book, whole lot of things. What's the best way for them to do so, Paolo?
Well, I would say probably the best way is to start from my website, which is aleria.tech. It's ALERIA.tech. There's a page there. There are links to my book. Also, if you go to any online bookseller, you look up Measuring Inclusion, you'll find my book. I would say, yeah, those are two easy ways. Anybody that wants to reach out on LinkedIn, I'm very easy to find. There are not too many Paolo Gaudianos out there, especially not working in DI. And I'm always happy to speak to anyone, especially anyone that really feels very strongly against DEI and wants to understand that there is a better way, and that, yes, the motivations are good, the execution has been not so good, but there are ways to preserve those motivations and do them in a way and execute them in a way that actually benefits everyone. So anybody that wants to reach out to me, more than welcome to do so.
Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.